Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us today and talking about sustainability and sustainable water systems. And so I'm Phil Thompson. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Bullitt Center here in Seattle, Washington. You get my contact information right there. If you ever want to get a hold of me, reach out. Welcome that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Bullitt Center to start with, and then their drinking water, wastewater systems, and then some implications for the future. So here's the Bullitt Center. It's a beautiful building that was opened in 2013. It was kind of the idea behind it was sort of developed by Dennis Hayes, who is the president of the Bullitt Foundation, and he's also the co-founder of Earth Day back in 1970. And so the Bullitt Center was designed to meet the Living Building Challenge, which the idea is 200 years ago, there were Douglas fir trees living on this piece of land. And so those trees were able to survive off of the sunlight that hit the property as well as the water that hits the property. So what if we could build a building that did just that? And so, as I said, the building itself meets what's called the Living Building Challenge, developed by the International Living Future Institute. And the goal of the challenge more broadly is to build buildings that meet all of these so-called petals. So we have health, beauty, equity, water, site, materials, and energy. And so I'm just going to walk through these really quickly, but just in terms of the site, that it's in an urban setting. It's got a walk score of 99, so that checks the box for site. Energy, so since the building was opened in 2013, those 525 solar panels on top of the building, they've produced about 30% more power than the building has used since the time it was open. So they're constantly drawing power from Seattle Public Utilities, and then they're constantly sending power to Seattle Public Utilities. So in the winter months, when it's not so sunny, we can rely on the city to provide power, and then in the summer months we really overproduce. But as I said, if you add it all up, the building has produced about 30% more power than it's used. I won't get into this too much, but the building is heated and cooled with a ground source heat pump, and so that's been super effective at heating and cooling the building and really enabling us to take advantage of that differential in temperature between the subsurface and the temperature on the surface, and we don't have to use any fossil fuels to heat and cool the buildings. Awesome. And so the building also takes into consideration the health of the tenants. So the stairways are not tucked away in the side of the building. They're very prominently placed, and they're beautiful. I want to invite people to take the staircases, and the building has operable windows to control both temperature as well as daylight coming in and out of the building. And so it's really a comfortable place to be. No hazardous materials were used to construct the building. So there's this so-called red list. So this is really the first building to do that. And all of the wood that's used in the building. So this is a primarily timber construction building. It's really quite beautiful. It's the largest timber construction building built in Seattle since the 1930s. And all the wood comes from Idaho, from its Forest Stewardship Council certified timber. And equity, it's basically it's an open office concept where people can interact, and then we have these smaller spaces where people can have meetings and so forth. Of course, it's a beautiful building. It's won lots of awards over the years. But today we're here to talk about the water side of things. And so this building was designed to live off of its own footprint, as I mentioned. And so all of the water that hits the building is collected and treated. The gray water is treated by a wetland, and then there's composting toilets throughout the building. And I'll talk about these different systems separately now. So this is a little shot from the rooftop, and I love this picture, but I also just show it because the implementation of the drinking water treatment system was delayed several years because in order to meet the Washington State Department of Health requirements for water systems, any surface that comes into significant contact with the rainwater has to be free of any toxins, and of course that makes sense. And so the hurdle is that these solar panels had never been National Sanitation Foundation certified. So at the other NSF, I call it, so National Sanitation Foundation certified for the use in water systems, or being in contact with rainwater that's going to be used for potable water. And so that took a long time to kind of go through that NSF process. Fortunately, the solar panel manufacturer, SunPower, paid for that analysis, and eventually by 2018 the system went online. And so just to kind of give you an idea, in terms of precipitation, of course, Seattle has a very rainy reputation, but what a lot of people don't know is in the summer months it's really quite dry, and so you can see our precipitation is relatively low in the summertime. And so in order to accommodate that, we had to build a cistern that was large enough, so it's about a 50,000 gallon cistern that is able to hold enough water to get us through those drier summer months. And so you can see the days of storage. The goal is to have at least 30 days of storage at all times. And so the treatment system itself, I'm going to kind of zoom in here in just a second. You can see the water comes in from the roof, and there's a cyclone filter that kind of takes out leaves and larger debris. The water is stored in the cistern, and then it's treated in a kind of very straightforward treatment system that many of you are probably familiar with. So we have a cartridge filter, a 5 micron cartridge filter that's going to remove any particles larger than 5 microns. And then we're going to use a 0.5 micron carbon filter to remove any dissolved organic material that might be in the water, as well as any smaller particles. And there's some redundancy built in this system, so we have multiple 0.5 micron filters in order to just ensure that we're really getting that filtration that we need to meet the Department of Health standards and drinking water quality standards. And in between those two filters, we have ultraviolet light. So there's an ultraviolet light system that was installed for initial disinfection, but suffice it to say, the state doesn't recognize this system as providing disinfection per se. There's reasons behind that. You can read the paper and talk more about it then. But anyway, it's there, but we don't get credit for it when it comes to disinfection credits. And then so after the water is treated, or initially treated or filtered, it gets chlorine is added to it. There is some chlorine contact time that's required, and so here's just some photos of what the system looks like. And we had to install some additional piping in order to meet the contact time requirements for chlorine. And so the system, I mean, the water coming in is terrific. It's really it's not treating a lot, but we can look at the flow, and you can see that the average daily peak flow is around 500 liters per day. But then, of course, when we had the pandemic, it dropped off significantly. You can see it's starting to ramp up as people are going back to the office. And the peak hourly flow has been very consistent throughout at about 20 liters per minute. But getting back to the raw water characteristics, it's rainwater, so we might expect it to be slightly acidic due to the carbon dioxide in the water. Through turbidity, as I said, very, very low turbidity. I mean, just excellent source of water to start with. Pretty low alkalinity, so we have to add alkalinity to prevent corrosion throughout the building in the distribution system. And then there are a little bit of coliform bacteria due to birds and so forth. But generally speaking, raw water, really, really good. So as far as finished water, so we boost up that pH so it's not corrosive. The temperature of the water is very consistent. The cistern's in the basement of the building, and so that temperature's fluctuation. We live in a pretty temperate part of the world, so it's very, very stable temperature. As I said, we add chlorine at about target concentration of around a little over 1 milligram per liter, and then we try to have at least half a milligram per liter at the furthest point in the distribution system, which is on the 6th floor of the building. But the treated water turbidity, very low as well. There's that alkalinity I mentioned. And then we do have some disinfection byproducts that are produced due to some of the dissolved organic carbon that is in the water that isn't removed by those carbon filters. But these concentrations are far lower than the disinfection byproducts that we have for the city of Seattle drinking water. So just kind of quickly, you can just see the stability of the water quality. So we have our influent, the variability, it's there, of course, but then the effluent is very, very constant, high water quality coming out of the treatment system. Our chlorine, again, very, very consistent chlorine concentrations, both at the point of entry and, of course, at the furthest point in the building. So if you add up all the expenses, so like how much does it really cost? So we had to have some special roofing material, kind of a coating on the roof that's non-toxic, that was NSF certified. The cistern itself, treatment system, and so forth. So we can annualize these initial capital costs, which when you annualize it over 30 years at a 3% discount rate, it's about $60,000. And then we can add that to the operating costs. So this is really where the costs lie, is the annual operation of the system, where we have to pay an operator that's certified. There's testing and so forth, and so really it's that operating cost of $60,000 per year that's pretty significant. So I should have said that the annualized capital cost is about $7,000. And so at the end of the day, when we look at the cost per gallon, it ends up being about 50 cents a gallon, which is much more, of course, than city water, but it's cheaper than bottled water. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the wetlands and the gray water treatment. So on the 3rd floor balcony of the building, we have this wetlands. It's been planted with about 100 horsetail plants or so. The wetland drains into a drain field. The wetlands up here, and then if you see my mouse, drains into this drain field and goes to the subsurface after it's been treated. So in terms of operation and maintenance for the wetland, tenant education was important. Getting folks to scrape their plates before they put them in the dishwasher is important, just to kind of reduce the load of solids and BOD going to the wetland as much as possible. There's some issues initially around recirculation rates and how frequently we need to have those. And there were some issues with the pipes themselves, but those were all kind of worked through, and we've done a lot of testing over the years, and we can see that in terms of gray water production, it's fairly consistent, right around between 3,000 and 4,000 liters per week. And then, of course, the pandemic, we can see that gray water production dropped significantly. And then the effluent flow rates, where the interesting thing there is in the summer months, those plants transpire so much that there's the effluent flow goes to zero during the summer months. So that was an interesting, somewhat unexpected outcome, and because of that, the effluent was the permit, instead of being on a milligram per liter basis, we had for BOD and total suspended solids, we got a mass basis discharge permit rather than a concentration based permit. So speaking of BOD, so you can see the influent BOD is fairly consistent around 1,000 milligrams per liter. And then this wetland, after it got going, so it took about a year for it to really kind of kick in and get going. it really is consistently keeping the effluent VOD less than 10 milligrams per liter. And the same for the suspended solids. It's really terrific performance on the gray water treatment system. For E. coli, the story is a little bit different. The limit for effluent concentrations is around 1,000 CFUs for E. coli, and as you can see, the system has been unable to meet that about 25% of the time, and that's because there's no active disinfection for the system. So definitely one of the lessons learned for this this system was, for folks doing it in the future, you got to have some sort of active disinfection at the end of the pipe. UV disinfection would be just fine, just inline UV disinfection, and we would eliminate that little issue there with the E. coli discharges. But in general, the gray water treatment system worked really, really well. And finally, just to kind of quickly talking about the composting toilets. So there's composting toilets on all 6 stories of the building up until just spring of this year, up to 2021. But when you go into the bathroom, the toilet senses you, and about a tablespoon of surfactant goes into the toilet, and then you do your business, and the rest is history. So there's no water used in those composting systems. Everything goes straight down to these compost bins, and then intermittently the compost bins are emptied out, and the liquid that passes through goes into some storage tanks, and that liquid is pumped out about every 6 weeks. And so this is the way it worked up until recently, up until, as I said, the spring of this year. All of these compost, the challenge was that the compost, I can just go to this little slide here. So first of all, it was very effective, but there was not a mixing tank for all the waste. And so all those different compost bins had different levels of usage. And so the big lesson learned here is if you're going to use composting toilets, you can do it. But you want to mix all your waste first and then distribute it to those compost bins so that you have even distribution and equal levels of use in all of those different compost bins. Also, the space was very cramped, and so it was really hard to do maintenance. So if you're going to use composting toilets, you got to have those bins have to have lots of room around them so that there could be maintenance done, and then having more bins than you think you need. So having 25 to 30%, maybe 40% more, just have some redundancy in case you have to take something out of service. And so if those things can all be done, you can definitely use composting toilets effectively. Because the amount of space is fixed in the building, they have since taken out the composting toilets, and they've installed a vacuum system that uses gray water to flush the toilet. So this is a new gray water treatment system. So they couldn't use the wetland effluent to flush the systems because the wetland was not National Sanitation Foundation certified. And so they have a new treatment system that's has a biological front end, and then there's some filtration media. It's disinfected, and then that water now is used to flush the toilets for the vacuum system. So that was a quick run through of the Bullitt Center's water systems. Happy to answer any questions that you might have. And as I said, feel free to reach out to me by email if needed as well. Thank you.